Happy Saturday, folks. Hope you're doing well. Today, we're going to be covering stories that kind of sputtered near the end of Friday, and we'll be talking about them today on this beautiful Saturday. Hope you're enjoying your day. I'm looking forward to talking about all of it. First, we'll be talking is Melanie Joly, liberal minister, had a visit from the Palestinian mafia saying, you are, in fact, a baby killer. And they decided to let her know in front of her apartment in Ottawa. We'll be covering that as well as an extremist group. Terrorist group, as some would say, is set up an embassy for a fake country in BC. We'll be covering that, and as well as Republican congressional members are putting their foot forward, asking Canada to remove a very harmful bill that Canadians have never liked, but it's been harmful to American companies, and we'll be talking about all of that. Welcome to the Elevate Podcast, everyone. I'm so grateful to have you all on once again. I'm your host, Josh. And if you get any value from today's episode, take the time to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us to grow, helps us to get to new audiences, and helps get this in front of people who didn't otherwise see there's a different option than what the mainstream media has to offer. Now, let's get into the first story, shall we? So yesterday, it was documented on X from Yves Zangler, who we'll talk about here shortly. He's currently running for the leadership of the NDP party here in Canada. 50 rallied in front of Genocide Joly, home tonight to denounce her repeated lies about Canada ending arms shipments to an Israeli military annihilating Gaza. And this is the 10-second clip of the crowd going wild. So that took place, and shortly after, you had MPs from the Liberal Party talking about how this crosses a line. You cannot be showing up to politicians' homes. This isn't right. Even Anthony Housefather, who is Jewish, who's not been happy about what's been going on with these Palestinian protests, but has been quiet and has said things at times, but overall been very quiet on the issue. And he said this, says protesting outside the private residence of Melanie Joly is wrong. It would be equally wrong to protest outside of the residence of any other person. Families, neighbors, and personal spaces should be off limits. And he, along with others, were commenting on this very issue, that this is not right, this is crossing a boundary, and quite frankly, yes, I don't think we should be protesting at politicians' homes, no matter how much you dislike them. However, in this case, when you have propped up this group, when you have allowed them to run rampant for 2 years inside of Jewish communities, allowing them to firebomb synagogues, shoot at Jewish schools, and essentially terrorize communities in this country, in Montreal and Toronto, and you were very, very quiet on it, now all of a sudden they show up at your house, and now it's like, oh, we can't have them here. Okay. You propped this up. You continue to allow this to happen. You allowed this to continue to be a thing. We can compare this to other protests. We can compare this to other issues that, we're shut out with something called the Emergencies Act. But for this one, we get a little weird. This one, we get a little touchy. And this one, we actually say we're going to declare Palestinian statehood and reward this behavior. You tell me if that makes sense to you. And this was partially the issue. And what we're seeing here is we're going to start seeing an increase in this more and more and more. Because liberal politicians have continued to cater to this ideology that the more violent they get in their threats, the more violent they get in their approach, the more that you will cave to them. That is why we saw Mark Carney come out and say, if this happens, and this happens, i.e. Hamas drops their arms and they leave Gaza, then we'll give Palestine statehood. And then shortly after that, what had happened? Well, Hamas says, no, you give us Palestinian statehood, and then we'll leave. This is what you're going to get, and you're going to see a lot more of it. And you have guys like Yves Zangler, as I said earlier, who is leading the charge on this, who wants to become the next leader of the NDP party, which is the New Democratic Party here in Canada. Those who are Americans watching the show, this is our very, very far left party, who lost in dramatic fashion this past election. And essentially the guy who was leading them, Jagmeet Singh, ruined all the work of the face of this party, who was Jack Layton, who actually got these guys to a point of being the official opposition in this country, which is one of the highest positions you can get a party to that isn't actual governance. So that was huge. And then Jagmeet Singh, inside 9 years, took this party and turned it into nothing. They were terrible. Our three-party system essentially has turned into a two-party system because of how badly he screwed up. So he's now left the fray. Eve Angler is now all up in it right now. And he is as far left as you can get. And he is the one who's encouraging these marches. He's the one who's encouraging this focus. He's the one who's encouraging this violence. And we saw what happened to Jagmeet Singh. We saw what happened that when he was, I would say, compromised by an extremist ideology, how it actually impacted our politics here in this country. We completely sabotaged our relationship with a country that is the number 3 economy in the world in India, and now doesn't want to do any trade with us until we deal with the nonsense that we've allowed happen, which we will get to here shortly. But Eve Angler is a dangerous person with dangerous ideology, and he is looking to hopefully be the next leader of the NDP party, he says. We'll see how close he actually gets. We'll see how much support he actually has in the party, and we'll see how far left the NDP really have become when they get around to having a leadership election in that party. But the fact this man is organizing these types of movements, organizing these types of events, attacking MPs, and intimidating them at their place of residence just shows you how far we are going in this country. We already have one activist in politics in Guilbeault, who we know climbed and violated the residence of Ralph Klein, the premier of Alberta at the time. Somehow, some way, he ended up getting into politics. A man who was arrested. There's plenty of evidence and photos of him being arrested. He's in politics. Eve Angler could be next if you don't pay attention. But alas, I move on to our next story. Here we have images from BC, where a Gurdwara, which is a Sikh place of worship, decided to put up Republic of Khalistan up on the side of their building, essentially treating it as an embassy of sorts for a fake country. Khalistan, for those who don't know who these guys are a group of people who essentially wanted to separate from India and wanted to make their own country called Khalistan. We have separatists in every country. You know, those people kind of exist. However, these people have gone to the nth degree since predominantly the 70s and the 80s, where they have caused a lot of chaos. They've killed a lot of people and actually committed many acts of terrorism in order to push their ideology. When I said earlier about Jagmeet Singh, this was the group that he had ties to. This group hates India. This group wants their own country. They essentially, for the most part, were kicked out of India. And they essentially ended up gaining ground in Canada here because we are a lot more sympathetic to their cause. And now here we are, some odd 30 years later, and we got this, where they're setting up Republic of Khalistan. And, you know, you can say it's a joke. You can say it's kind of hokey, whatever you want to say. Sure. But the fact they're this bold, let's talk about the definition of what the term republic means, shall we? A state which supreme power is held by the people and their elected representatives, and which has an elected or nominated president rather than a monarch. So you can call this an embassy, or you can say this is a flex to say they want to have their own country inside Canada. And no one's been talking about this. This was actually not really brought up at all, except for in specific circles here in Canada. But when it comes to the Canadian mainstream, this is nowhere near being discussed. This should be concerning to you. It should be concerning to us. The fact that this group, who has committed many terrorist acts, who have groups who spawned off of the idea of Khalistan, which is the Tiger Force group, who is seen as a terrorist organization here in Canada, continue to operate with impunity. This group has typically been laughed off. This group has been typically shrugged off by every party here in this country because they've never really been taken seriously until they start doing stuff like this. Well, we saw with the G7 when they protested in Calgary with all their yellow flags, protesting the fact that Modi was here in Canada. Khalistan is a violent ideology. Khalistan is not peaceful, and they want to make sure they get their share. They want their own country, and if they can't get it inside India, they're going to get it here in Canada unless we speak up about it. As we saw just a couple months ago, members of this group shot up a bar in BC because they stood against this group. They're violent, they mean business, and they will continue to take ground until they are taken seriously. And that's how this all goes. Joly says here, how is the declaration of a Republic of Khalistan at Guru Nanak Sikh Gurdwara in Surrey, BC within Canada is being allowed to stand? Is this not a direct challenge to our national sovereignty and unity? Isn't it unconstitutional and potentially seditious under Canadian law? I think that's a good way of putting it. Is it not those things? I guess we will see, and I won't hold my breath in the RCMP looking into this. But we'll finish off with this, which I think was very interesting. Major threat to trade. U.S. Congress Republicans call for Canada to rescind Online Streaming Act. This has been a cornerstone and corner piece of the Liberal Party over the past 10 years. They've introduced a lot of laws in regards to what we see online. In Canada, we have the CRTC, the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Board, that essentially polices anything on our TVs, on our radio waves, this, that, the other. And they've been wanting more and more control over what happens online. So the Liberals have introduced bills like Bill C-18, which is the Online News Act, which has not allowed news to appear on Facebook. The Online Streaming Act, which is Bill C-11, which forces companies to favor Canadian content in their algorithms and downgrading foreign content on their platforms. And then they also introduced Bill C-63, which is the Online Harms Act, which is they wanted to introduce a board appointed by the Prime Minister who could have sweeping powers to essentially demand social media platforms take posts off of their platforms, and they would have to go ahead and do that. This is the three-headed monster. C-18, C-11 have gone through. C-63 saw some issues because they tried to mask it as we're protecting children, so they ended up having to break it apart, and they'll see if they can get that passed later this year, I'm sure. But this is what the Liberal Party has done. They continue trying to control what we see online. They continue to try and control the narrative. And again, you look at any Google search in Canada, even to our American listeners, do have some fun. Feel free. Go use a VPN and make sure it's set in Canada and look up any type of headline or anything that's popular in the media, and you'll see what gets populated. It'll all be Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Globe and Mail, CBC, CTV, all on the first page. You will never see anything independent. You'll never see anything on the right wing, and you'll struggle even to maybe get National Post, which is a right-leaning publication, to be on that first page. National Post is probably the only one that even gets through. That is the manipulative nature of what these bills have done to us. So we can see Republicans in the states who have taken notice of this and say it's a major threat to trade. Republicans on an influential House committee are pushing top Trump administration officials to pressure Canada to kibosh its controversial Online Streaming Act, which they describe as a major threat to the trade relationship. In a July 31st letter obtained by National Post, 18 Republican members of Congress on the powerful House Ways and Means Committee ramped up pressure on the White House officials to get Canada to dump the discriminatory act the same way it ditched the digital sales tax in late June. The fact that the Online Streaming Act already imposes discriminatory obligations and threatens additional obligations imminently is a major threat to our cross-border digital trade relationship, reads the letter to U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. As bilateral trade negotiations continue, we urgently request that you engage with your Canadian counterparts to share concerns and rescind the Online Streaming Act they added. Greer, Bessent, and Lutnick are on the forefront of negotiations with Canada for a new trade deal that Mark Carney's government hopes will eliminate a host of new U.S. tariffs against key Canadian industries. The letter sheds light on how a growing number of influential U.S. politicians are using ongoing trade negotiations with Canada to push back against Canadian digital policies that impact American companies. And this is really the frustrating part about all this, right? We would love to have someone in power here in Canada that works for the people. Unfortunately, due to the likes of Donald Trump and due to the likes of our own media in this country, we can't seem to get anyone in power who actually cares about us. So now we have this situation. We have Mark Carney, who again has very limited leverage, has very limited power in terms of what he can do in foreign policy decisions, because we're in such a weakened position as a country. Now we have Donald Trump, who essentially is going to be dictating our policy here in this country. And these are policies, quite frankly, as a Canadian, I would love to see. Yes, I want to see them rescind the Online Streaming Act. I think it's stupid. The fact that the government has such power over what we see online these days in this country is not good. The fact you can't see news on Facebook or Instagram is concerning. And they'll say, well, it's not the government who did that. It's the companies made that decision. No. The companies were forced, due to Canadian legislation, to have to make that decision for themselves. That is the response to legislation coming in. So yeah, the government didn't come in like China style. It's like, you're going to do this and or else. However, legislation was introduced and Meta said, okay, well, we're not going to show news on our platforms anymore in Canada. This is how poor legislation is pushed here in this country. Or the fact that Republicans in the States are trying to push to get this moved and get out and rescinded. We'll take what we can get here in Canada, but this is not the way we would like to see it happen. We'd like to see ourselves take back ownership of our country. We'd like to see ourselves in Parliament, essentially, and see decisions that reflect the will of the people rather than the will of multinational corporations or, in some cases, in this case, or foreign nations. Sure, in this case, this is definitely to our benefit, but that's not always going to be the case. So we'll see what happens. But anyways, enjoy your Saturday. Have yourselves a good one. I'm out.